on your screen. There we go. So welcome back after lunch. I hope you all managed to get a rest and a break from your computer screen, because yes, there is something about sitting in front of our screens all day. It's not great for our bodies, is it? So welcome back after lunch. So what we're going to be looking at then this afternoon is based on having thought about what cultural attunement is in the last session, and then including it then within that bigger structure of the model. What we're going to be thinking about then in this afternoon then is to really focus on then how do we actually then develop cultural attunement? What are kind of some of the tools or concepts that might help us then, or prompt us or support us when we're in sessions, to actually help us to culturally attune and help us to kind of explore the client's lived experience specifically. So what we're not doing to stop us from doing that thing of competency, which is, what do I know about that particular identity? So how can I apply it to my client? So this afternoon, again, we're going to kind of turn it on its head and go, how do we actually support ourselves to really attune to the client's own lived experience? So where we're going to kind of start in terms of understanding then cultural attunement is to recognize that cultural attunement, as I said earlier, exists within the model of working within diversity. And of course, then it lives within all of the 5 components of the model. So just to recap, that the components being systemic and structural context, component 2 being identity, component 3 being power, component 4 being therapeutic relationship, and component 5 being process. Cultural attunement then is not its own component, but it lives and breathes throughout all of those all 5 components, but most specifically within components 2, identity, component 4, therapeutic relationship, and component 5, therapeutic process. So so when we're thinking about identity, when we're thinking about therapeutic relationship, when we're thinking about therapeutic process, when we're looking at those 3 components, we are ensuring that we are thinking about those components and the way we're working with our clients through cultural attunement. So it's not so, and this is why, again, it's not the bolt-on. Remember at the very beginning of the morning, I spoke about one of the problems with working with diversity, that it was a bolt-on. What you can straight away start to see is that cultural attunement is not a bolt-on. It's not something that in the model exists on its own as a separate component. It is within all the other components. But as I said, though, specifically though, and where we can most see where, or if we are being culturally attuned, is if we are considering cultural attunement within the components of identity, relationship, and process. So how are we then going to think about how do we then develop cultural attunement? By looking, what we're going to do is look at those 3 components in turn and see how we can then think about cultural attunement within identity, how we can think about cultural attunement in our therapeutic relationships, and how we can think about cultural attunement within therapeutic processes. So again, we're going to walk our way very kind of systematically through those 3 components. Okay, so I'm just going to switch back on the slide deck. Any just immediate kind of reflections or anything you want to mention now from anything we covered before lunch? Any kind of leftovers that anybody wants to mention now at all before we jump into this? Again, just want to give people an opportunity just to share, reflect, or bring anything to our attention if needed. Nope. Okay. So I'm just going to slide share. There we go. So this slide really just recaps what I've just said ultimately, which is this is our kind of starting point this afternoon, which is, so now that we know what cultural attunement is, how do we actually develop cultural attunement? So we're going to look at cultural attunement through 3 of the 5 components. We're going to focus in this first session after lunch, we're going to look specifically at component number 2, which is identity. And then, and within identity, how do we develop and be culturally attuned to our clients? And then, as I just mentioned, we're then going to look at cultural attunement within the components of therapeutic relationship and process. So on to the next slide. So specifically here then, excuse me, looking at component number 2 of the model, which is identity. So component 2, identity, we're going to look at 2 particular ways that are going to support us in understanding whether we are culturally attuning to our clients. And those 2 elements are, first of all, the element of 2 identities. So how can we look more closely at the identity of us as the counsellor and the identity of the client? How will that help us be culturally attuned? And then second of all, and it's already been mentioned helpfully already today, which is then looking at the difference between collectivist and individualist cultures. So understanding these elements of the component of identity, this is going to support us in helping us to then think about and develop cultural attunement. Okay. So again, what I'm kind of showing you really is the map, building a picture of the map that we're kind of navigating throughout the day. So where we're at just for now, we're looking specifically at component number 2, identity. And within that, we're going to now explore the actual 2 identities in the room, and then thinking about collectivist and individualist cultures. Okay, so thinking specifically about 2 identities. Just to remind you that in the working within diversity model, our starting point is that there, of course, are 2 identities in the room. That there is both the identity of the counsellor and identity of the client. And so looking at, sorry, my slide deck won't share. So specifically when we think about identity, on this next slide, what I have is the identity wheel. So in the very center of the picture is the word identity. And like a wheel with spokes coming out of that middle dot, at the end of each spoke is another label which identifies all the different identity characteristics with identity. So we have identity in the middle, and imagine from that word identity, there are spokes coming out from that center circle, and at the end of each spoke is one identity characteristic. So hence why I call it an identity wheel. And so what this identity wheel consists of then are a number of identity characteristics that we each hold. And again, some of you will be familiar with the identity wheel if you've been to previous trainings of mine, or equally if you've got the book Working Within Diversity. So the identity wheel is a tool that I created to help me really, what started off, all these tools evolved from my own practice to help me work within diversity and to better develop my cultural attunement. So on this identity wheel are a whole number of identity characteristics that we can use to, first of all, help ourselves understand our own identity. Because, of course, some of these identity characteristics are going to be more prominent in our self-identification, and others are going to be much more in the background. Also, some of these identity characteristics are going to be visible to ourselves and to other people looking at us. And there are going to be other aspects of our identity that are going to be hidden or invisible. They don't show up physically in our body. So I think it's really important to recognize that identity, again, another metaphor that I use, identity is a bit like a Rubik's Cube. We all have the same number or types of identity. We all have the same identity characteristics, but how we define them and label them are going to be unique to each and every one of us. And so our identity is like a Rubik's Cube in which we configure our identity in its own unique combination based on which aspects of our identity are prominent at the front of our identity wheel and which ones hide in the background. And equally, which aspects of our identity are more visible at the foreground and are seen by other people, and which ones are hidden in the background. So I'm going to read out what the different identity characteristics are. And what I'm going to invite you to do and we'll do this, I mean, do this individually, but I will read out the identity characteristics, is as I read out the identity characteristics, I'd like to invite each of you then just to jot down for yourself, how would you self-identify within each of these characteristics? Okay. You can, if you want to, just simply write them as a list, or equally you might want to draw the actual wheel yourself, whatever you are most comfortable doing. Okay. So we're going to work our way around the wheel. And as I said, I'm going to invite each of you then to identify for yourself how you self-identify with these characteristics. Okay. I'm not going to, I should caveat that with what I won't do is specifically invite you then to share your wheel. Later on, it might be that there are questions and reflections about how you might want to think about your wheel in combination with cultural attunement, but I'm not going to be asking you to share your wheel with anybody else. Okay, so any answers you write down now are going to be just for yourself. Okay, so we're going to work our way around the wheel as such. So we're going to start off with gender. How do you self-identify your gender? So just jot down for yourself for the identity characteristic of gender. How do you self-identify? And with all of these, with each of these identity characteristics, I'd also like you to ask kind of a follow-up question with that, which is, does this show up visibly in your body? So can other people see this? Is it an aspect of your physical identity? And if it is, does it match or not match how you self-label? So an example of this, and I think this is, this is can be particularly true for gender, which is it might be that you self-identify as gender fluid, but physically and biologically, you are aware though that navigating the world though people might assume you are female or male. Like, so again, just kind of just challenge yourself a bit more deeply, say, okay, whilst I might self-identify for any one of these in a particular way, does that necessarily match with how other people might view and see me? Okay, it might match, it might not match. So the first characteristic we're doing at the moment is identifying at the moment is gender. So what do you self-identify as? How might other people identify you? Because I appreciate with a few of these, you might get misidentified. Is that the right word? Misidentified. Okay, the second one then being, oh, sorry, I'm just trying to move my screen out of the way. The second one then being ethnicity and heritage. How would you self-identify your ethnicity and heritage? Again, have a think about whether is that, do you hold an internal ethnicity and heritage, self-identify? Does that match with, or do you experience that that's what people assume you are, or do you find that again you often get misidentified? Now the next one being culture, I know this is a huge identity factor, and what I'm going to do is leave it really open to you and say, when you think about what your culture is, write down whatever comes to mind. When you think about, for you, when you talk about what's my culture, write down whatever comes to mind. because of course it covers so many different aspects. But what do you just initially automatically kind of lean into in terms of your lived experience when you talk about when you self-identify your culture? What does culture mean to you? What do you, let me say that again. When you're self-identifying your culture, what do you self-identify your culture to be? And again, as a reminder, each of these, think about whatever you're writing down for any one of these, does it match with what people assume about you or expect? Again, what are the does it match the projections, assumptions that or expectations that people have about you? Now, of course, you're going to get these slides afterwards anyway. So again, whilst we might not have time to fill this out fully, again, I invite you to kind of go back to this and fill out more fully, perhaps, if you want to in the future. Because I think it's, again, important to keep revisiting how we do self-identify. And of course, that will change over time as well, what our identity is. So moving around to the next one then, religion, faith and belief. So again, what do you self-identify when you identify your religion or faith or beliefs? Or spirituality, that's another word. I couldn't fit it in the circle, but when you think about religion, faith, beliefs or spirituality, what do you self-identify as? So we've done the first 4 together. What I'm going to invite you to do now is I'm going to kind of give you kind of 5 minutes or so to now individually work your way through any of the others. Okay, you're not going to have time to do all of it, as I said, but just to start giving yourself a flavour of what you might start to self-identify for the others, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to do that. Okay, work your way around the rest of the wheel. What I will do is I will read out the characteristics. So people just kind of jot down. Sorry, I should say that again. I'm going to read them out. So for some people will want to follow my guidance of reading around the circle. But if you don't want to follow my pace, please do just go ahead at your own pace to fill out the rest of the wheel for yourself, okay? So you can choose to ignore me or follow my guidance as whatever is appropriate for you, okay? So for those of you that are going to follow me around this wheel, the next one is ethics and values. So how might you just immediately, what comes to mind when you're thinking about your identity, and what ethics and values come to mind? The next one being age. How do you self-identify in terms of your age? And I think actually that's an interesting one, because whilst we might immediately think of age as a number, it might also be a category. Middle age, older age, young. I'm a young person. Again, it's whatever comes to mind when you think about how do you self-identify when it comes to age. The next characteristic being nationality. What's your nationality? How do you self-identify as nationality? The next characteristic being family dynamic. What's your... Again, I think the important thing with this wheel is that it's not necessarily about filling out the richness of each one. It's just about what might come immediately to mind when you think about that's part of who you are. So family dynamic. As I said, it would be really helpful. I think it'd be really important as well for each of you perhaps to fill this in a bit more fuller when you have the time and space to do it. The next characteristic being language. So again, what do you self-identify as your language or languages? Is it that you say you have a first language, primary language, or a mother tongue? Again, start to really attune to what some of these what are some of the words or language you put to your own identity. The next one being sexuality. The next characteristic is ability/disability. The next one, again, it's similar to culture or family dynamics because this is very much about lived experience. The next one is narrative/stories. Now, of course, we don't have time for you to be able to capture this as fully as perhaps as you'd like to, but maybe you want to identify perhaps a particular story, just maybe in shorthand or something, just jot down for yourself kind of what's a lived experience, a particular narrative or story that is significant to you in terms of who you are or your identity. And I can give an example of that for myself. For me, the narrative of how my name is spelt, for example, is part of my identity. So just in this example, so again, something that for you is an aspect of your lived experience, your narrative or a story that you've experienced, or a story about you that is significant to who you are in terms of your identity. Then the next identity characteristic is class. Do you identify as being part of a class? Maybe not. Is that something familiar to you or not? Is it part of, again, you can start to see that these are not mutually exclusive categories. Class in some culture, and again, it's very linked to culture. In some cultures, it's identified as class. Maybe in other cultures, it's about caste systems. Again, it's about what is part of your identity and upbringing and heritage. The next one being status. That can, again, what comes to mind when you think of status? That can be work. That can be status in terms of any role that you hold, whether that's to do with familial role or a professional role, but your status. Again, what's significant to you? Might be to do with that you're studying, maybe that and appreciate some of you are training or just finished your training. So again, maybe is it significant for you right now that your status is as a trainee therapist, counsellor or psychologist, or just newly qualified maybe? So again, what's part of your identity right now in terms of your status? The next one, then, we've only got 3 more. The next one is education. So again, what education do you have or don't you have? Perhaps part of your identity is, I don't know, again, an example is it's the education I had, I left school at 16 maybe, or I went to college but then started working and I chose not to go to university, or I did go to university and I got this level of education. So again, it's about its relationship to your identity as much as what the exact education. It's not just about the exact education you had. It's also about the significance or relationship you then have with it. I know for a lot of my clients previously, it was really important that because it's part of their narrative and lived experience, that they were perhaps the first person in their family to go to university. So it isn't just the simple factual element of, oh, I've got a degree. It's actually, I was the first one in my family to go to university and get a degree. So again, what does that mean to you? The next one then is race or racialized identity. How do you feel race as a social construct? How do you feel you've been racialized? And what importance or significance is that to you? And the final one then on the wheel is if you identify as neurodivergent or neurotypical. And if you identify as neurodivergent, perhaps within that, what particular neurodivergent identities do you have or identify with? And again, it's about your relationship with it. Are you potentially newly diagnosed? Is it were you diagnosed in childhood? Are you self-diagnosed? Are you currently going through an assessment or a diagnosis assessment? So again, as you can start to see, inviting you just to think very quickly or briefly about each of these. It's not just about the label itself you might give yourself, it's about the relationship you have with it as well. So hopefully that starts to get you to think about when we start, well, help you to start thinking about that when we think about two identities in the room, there is a lot in the room because we are sitting with this identity wheel for ourselves, but also for our clients. And so these are two very rich, full identities that are in relationship with one another. And of course, for each of us, for yourselves as the counsellor and for your clients, particular aspects of these identities, as I mentioned earlier, are going to be at the forefront, more visible or more highlighted and dominant aspects of the client's identity, but equally in yours as well. So what I'm going to invite each of you to do on your own, just for a couple of minutes, is having started to think about your identity through this identity wheel tool, I'm going to invite you to think about what impact or influence do you think your identity has on your work with clients? So more generally at this stage, what impact or influence does your identity have on your work with clients? And again, in thinking about identity, this identity wheel like a Rubik's Cube, it might be that particular identity characteristics have a greater impact or influence. So inviting you just for a few minutes to think about what impact or influence does your identity or particular identity characteristics have on your work with clients. So I'll just repeat the question again. What impact or influence does your identity or any particular identity characteristic have on your work with clients? And just as perhaps some prompt questions to help you think about that first question, have a think then about, because of your identity, because of these identity characteristics, do they set up expectations or assumptions that clients might then have about you? So thinking about the impact and influence on your clients and on your work, does it set up any particular expectations or assumptions then that clients have about you? And what might they be? What assumptions or expectations might your clients have about you because of your identity? I'll just recap those questions. So what impact or influence does your identity have on your work with your clients? And because of your identity, what expectations or assumptions have you found that clients make about you or have made about you? And maybe not just about you, but then because of your identity, maybe expectations or assumptions about the work you're going to do together or what's going to happen in the room between the two of you. And if you can think of any particular examples, perhaps for yourself, of where that's happened, maybe follow that up with then, okay, so I have client X, he made that assumption about you. So then what happened because of it? If you are able to identify any particular examples, perhaps try and capture that. So my client made assumption X about me because of this aspect of my identity, therefore dot dot dot. What happened because of it? I can see heads down still, so maybe a few more moments for people to continue to capture what's coming up for you. So yeah, thinking about the impact and influence of your identity on your work and any expectations or assumptions then clients have about you and about the work you're going to be doing together. And if you can find any particular examples where you've experienced that, and perhaps you want to capture that as well. And what happened because of it. So with client X, they assumed this about me, and so this then happened in the work or in the relationship because of it. I'm going to stop sharing and bring it back into gallery view because I want to give people a chance to finish capturing their thoughts, but also just open up the space if anybody would like to feedback and reflect on what that tool and activity perhaps brought up for them in terms of, were you able to identify perhaps how your identity does influence your work and any expectations or assumptions that clients do make about you, and any example perhaps you want to share. As I said, it's an invitation. If nobody or if anybody doesn't want to, that's absolutely fine. But I also want to give people a chance to share if they choose to. MT, please.
I really liked the identity wheel exercise, because it made me think about how much can be both visible and invisible at the same time. And
Yes.
like a good example, I guess, from my identity wheel is around age. So as an older person, for some people actually maybe that's both as well. Like some people will see it, some people won't, but also as an older woman you become less visible in society, so it can be both. So I thought that was super interesting. And there was also one of the identities, the characteristics that actually I'm not sure where I am, and I'm also not sure how I'm perceived. So there was a big question mark around that for me
Yes.
and for other people. So I just found that really interesting to think about.
Yes. Yeah, of course, that's great. I mean, because again, this is the thing about identity. It's not in our identities, we're not fixed. We aren't just this identity that we are right now, that we've always been and forever will be. And I think in the same way that we think about cultural attunement as a process and the fluidity of cultural attunement, in the same way our identity is as well. And so I think that's great to actually to hear that actually there are question marks around, because there is something about, because how often do we think about, well, who am I? What's my full identity? And have I really ever sat and thought about that aspect of myself before? So I think it's again, sitting in the not knowing. I think that's a really good example of that. Yeah. And if you don't know, gosh, it opens up a whole thing around, well, I wonder, be curious and about, oh, I don't know how other people then perceive that part of me either. Yeah.
And what does that then
Yes.
feel like?
Yeah.
If I feel like I'm in a state of flux somewhere, but I'm being read as something else,
Yes.
what does that then feel like? So yes, so
Yeah.
much in that.
Yeah. And then what then happens between the two of you, because it's an unknown for me and for the other person, and does that influence on how they're showing up? Is it influencing how I'm showing up? Yeah. There's a lot there once you start to unpick it. Yeah. Anyone else? Jada, yes.
I think it also depends on what information is available about you online as well. So I've noticed that I've had when I get inquiries, sometimes they assume that I might know their family because they assume I'm from a particular ethnic group. I noticed in terms of working with other Muslim clients, it's almost as if I don't need to explain anything, you'll just get it. That's the same for like ethnic cultures, even if I'm not from the same ethnic culture as the client. Another thing I've noticed is if your education's available online, I noticed that I seem to get referrals or inquiries for like presenting problems I don't work with, or like quite severe complexity, because there's an assumption that I can almost work with anything because they see my title, but I don't think that's the case either. And I've noticed also assumptions about language skills from people sometimes assume I can speak certain languages and I'm not even from that region. So I don't know if it's based on my name, I'm not sure, but there's a lot of assumptions going on. And sometimes I think it can it can help in terms of relationship building, and sometimes it can hinder, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. But again, really useful to notice then that what does get made, like what assumptions are being made about your identity, because it absolutely then influences how, like you just said, Jada, that really good example of, well, it actually influences then how people are actually showing up and how they're presenting and what they're expecting you to then offer them in return, or how you're then going to show up in return. Yeah.
And it also depends on their identity. So for example, I've noticed sometimes people also question my education and my training, maybe because they hear my accent, and I've got before I had a very strong London accent. Yeah, so sometimes I think you can be seen as competent, but also incompetent, depending on where someone positions you.
Absolutely. Yes, because of course, assumptions and expectations are not, again, they're not mutually exclusive to be either all good or all bad. It's very individual based absolutely on who is the person making the assumption and expectation, because your identity is in relationship to theirs. So the assumption that someone's going to make about you is because of who that person is, from their social location, from their lived experience, not from who you actually are.
Yeah. And another thing I've noticed with I noticed that a lot of clients ask for faith match, and they seem to assume that if you're of the same faith, you're going to, like, for couples therapy, for example, where there's problems, they almost sort of position you as you're going to tell them what's right and wrong, according to the faith, which is not your role. But there's that assumption, and they're like very insistent on having a faith match, even if you recommend someone else. They're like, no, they need to be Muslim because this is the problem we're dealing with, and they need to understand X, Y, Z. So again, there's a lot of assumptions being made, also of what your position are, and also what they think you're going to be offering them.
Yes, absolutely. So our role as counsellor, and again, we'll go into a bit more detail on that specifically in the next section, but our role as counsellor is also seen through a very particular lens based on that person's identity, which includes their faith, their background, their status, their understanding. Like lots in their identity wheel is going to influence how they even view you as a counsellor, because of who they think you are. Yeah, based on their identity. Yeah, thank you, Jada. Yeah, Nyla, please.
Yeah, I just find it really interesting to reflect on that visible versus not so visible aspect and how that might show up in your practice and the assumptions. It's hard to know actually what assumptions our clients might have about us unless they explicitly, like we explicitly ask, or they volunteer that. So I don't know, like I was trying to think of examples that have came up for me. it's interesting the point you made about language, Jada. I've had kind of the opposite of that actually. So I'm mixed heritage. I'm half Pakistani and Scottish, and people have made assumptions before they've met me when they've just had a name, like, oh, you've been referred to so and so, especially when I used to have my dad's surname, that actually they've said to me like, oh, I didn't think you were going to like understand me or speak English that well or anything, but then when they hear me speak, obviously it's clear I'm a native speaker and stuff. So it's, yeah, I've had some assumptions that way about things. And yeah, more recently I've started putting my pronouns, as you can see, next to my name, and I do that in my initial client emails as well. I do wonder how that lands with clients, because I think also it's hard to escape like all the negativity in the media and social media as well about, if you're non-binary, for example, people's views about that. And sometimes I wonder, like, are clients less likely to want to see me because I've got that there? But we ultimately don't know unless, yeah, unless we ask. So it's just really interesting to reflect on.
Yeah. But thank you for sharing that, Nyla, because I think what you're really demonstrating then is in the not knowing, you know, what we've been saying all day about actually to culturally attune is to not know and to then be curious about it. So for me, it's actually a really lovely position that you're all in to go, oh, actually, I don't know what people think about me, because what that does, it opens up opportunity then to go, you know, particularly perhaps in assessment stages, if you do assessments with your clients, or even if you don't do assessments and are allocated clients based on your particular context, you know, to make those, you know, not to make this, to be curious about the assumptions that the client has made about you. And it might be along the lines of, I'm curious what you might have thought about coming to see me today, or about coming to see me in particular, based on what you'd been told about me, or what you'd seen perhaps about my name. So for me, and again, I think this is the real difference between competence and attunement. Competence is, oh yeah, I know what assumptions people make about me, and that applies to everybody, versus attunement being, I'm really curious about what assumptions people make about me, and what are those assumptions based on? Is it based on my ethnicity, my assumed ethnicity? Is it based upon my name? Is it based upon my surname? Is it, so for me, it's actually about opening up the space for not knowing even more. That sounds really counterintuitive, doesn't it? But it is about opening the space to go, oh gosh, there's even more I don't know. Let me go and explore that. Let me be curious about it. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, people make assumptions about my name equally all the time, and then with my name assume what my ethnicity is, assume what languages I speak, assume what my actual ethnicity and where my parents were born, and I'm like, oh, we got that all wrong. But for me, it's curious, because based on those assumptions, I know then that I'll have those conversations with my clients, that when I ask them that, and they might go, well, Myra, I assumed you were this particular ethnicity, or you spoke this particular language. It's not that I will necessarily correct them and go, well, no, I don't. Instead, I'll be like, well, in having made that assumption that I'm a particular ethnicity, what have you then thought about who I'm going to be, or what you're going to get from me? What would you assume? So it isn't so for me, it's not about correcting the fact. For me, it's exploration then of what they think would happen relationally. Again, it's always about the relationship. Because the moment you go into fact, you're shutting down exploration around the relationship. Because if I was to turn around and go, oh no, I'm not that ethnicity, actually I'm this one, you're taking your client away from where they were, and you're relocating them in fact. And it's really hard to take them back and go, so what did you assume? Because once you've moved them, they're now filled with all of these new thoughts about, oh, Myra, you're actually that, for example. Now let me get my head around that. And it's really hard to take them back. So before I not even try to move them, but before I even attempt to correct them, I never do correct them. So before I even want to try and get pulled into correcting them or giving them an answer, I, of course, don't give them an answer. Instead, what I'm doing is exploring what they actually think about it, what they actually feel about it. Okay, so you've assumed that my surname is this, or my first name being that, or you've assumed this about my ethnicity. Okay, tell me more. So if you've assumed that I'm Pakistani, for example, okay, so I'm really curious then what you thought I would be like, or what you assumed how I would be and what you would get from me. Yeah. So for me, it's always taking up that position of curiosity about their fantasies and assumptions and projections and expectations, because of course what that does is just reveals more about them, and that's the work, isn't it? Giving them a fact, does that help us explore the client's Narnia or world? It doesn't. So I kind of stay away from the answer, as much as they can at times be quite insistent in trying to get an answer out of you. I'm also pulled into, and I appreciate this is a bit of my psychodynamic thinking here, but I'm curious about why they're insistent to get a factual answer. They'll never get one from me, but even them being quite insistent in getting a factual answer, I'm going, I would rather than being pulled into giving them an answer, I'll still be like, yeah, but I'm curious about how that's going to help you. I'm curious about what that will do to our relationship. I'm curious about how that will change what you think of me. Because let's just, I might give them a hypothetical answer. I go, okay, well, if I was to say that I'm Indian, not Pakistani, how might that change how you think about me? So even then, and neither of them are actually true about me, but just to give them a hypothetical is to get them to think about how they are relating to me. That's more important for the work than them having an actual answer. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely going to change our practice going forward. I think I've actually, if I'm being honest, I've missed that opportunity to be curious in that situation. And like in the past when that occurred, I did veer more towards just giving a factual answer and correcting, and then definitely going to change that.
Yeah, I'm glad, because I think, how can I put it? For a couple of reasons. I think the reason why it's asked is because the knowing is safer. Let's go back to that risk and fear thing we spoke about earlier. Clients ask because I think they think it's going to be safer for them. But actually, what it does, almost like a defense mechanism, they can then hide their expectations and assumptions behind it. And by knowing what you are, they're a bit like, oh, phew, now I know. That's it, let's move on. For me, I want to stay curious about what they thought, who they think I am, because that will tell me, not everything, but that will tell me a lot about why I'm then experiencing them in the way that they're showing up and relating to me. That for me is like a real key element of the work. But I appreciate I work and I'm mindful that we're coming from all different modalities here, but because I work psychodynamically, I think for me, answering the question shuts down the opportunity to then actually have that exploration with them.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question?
Please.
What do you think about like therapists who have like their identities, like state them on their website, for example, like if they explicitly say, like, I don't know, like for myself, for example, mixed heritage, multi-neurodivergent counselling psychologist, do you think that's then hindering that curiosity? Or
no, I think, again, I think for me, cultural attunement isn't about, right, they can't know anything about me, so therefore I will just want to know their assumptions. For me, cultural attunement is, how are they showing up based on what they might know about me that is fact, and what assumptions they're making. So again, they're not mutually exclusive, because of course there are going to be things on my website which, as well as in my visible identity, that factually clients are going to know about me. And for me, it's not about whether they know. Yeah, it's not about whether they know the fact about me. It's what impact does it have on them, and how does it influence how they're showing up in relationship with me. So based on my name and what I visibly look like, clients can, a 99.9% will be, guess that I'm Muslim. I have had, some people along the line to try to make out like, oh, I didn't know, but with a photo with my name, then it's visible that they will assume that I'm Muslim. But there are also other aspects of my identity that people are going to know about me. I do on my social media talk about being an ADHDer, for example. So being neurodivergent myself, but it's not about them showing, like I said, it's not about them turning up and going, oh, Myra, I know that you're ADHD. It's about my curiosity is, client, you know that I'm ADHD, if they've mentioned it. So what does that mean to you? What does that mean for our relationship? What does that mean for you being able to be here, feel safe, feel that you can trust me? How does that influence what we can and can't do in the room? Yeah. So quite right, Nyla. It's not about, oh, do I give them fact or not? It's about whatever they happen to know about me, what does it mean for them? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody? Iman, please.
Hey, this is also interesting. I feel like identities come up a lot in my work because I think I fall into like a really weird gap where like to some people I might be come across as if like I'm a revert to the religion where I became a Muslim and was British born, and then to others I might have like an ethnic identity that they're like, oh, so you relate to me and therefore you should know. So it's like this really weird gap. But I've had like I think at one point I had like multiple clients who are all bringing something challenging the identity kind of relationship because on one hand I used to think that what if my visibility of being a Muslim would hinder some relationships and people's ability to open up, but then that used to prove different where, for example, I'd work with people who identified as, you know, travelers, and like how that my identity almost gave them the idea that I would understand what it's like to be different in society generally, so that challenged it. And then one of my most like, even now I still think about him, like I think he had had multiple therapists before and it just wasn't working out, and then I had him for a while and we got on, but then I think our sessions were ending and he thought it was ending sooner than it was, and had sent in a like email to my managers, and the email listed all our identity factors and why my identity is like being female, being Muslim, being working for that company, my ethnicity, like all of these things would like hinder our relationship or like has affected the work or something like that. Luckily my managers were like so straight, like because they're all psychodynamic and they're like, oh, this is like telling. But it did help in terms of going back and identifying each point and being like, what is it bringing out for you? But it is really challenging work because you suddenly are watching all the things that somebody assumes of you, and it almost, I don't know, it brings up a lot of questions around that, because I think it really like I almost had clients who were proving me other ways and giving me another way to think about identity and how they're perceiving me in the relationship. And that really challenged my perspective in one way. And then another one, which has actually identified everything that they can see of me or what they think of me. And then like almost as like a complaint, but not really, because afterwards when we went through it, it ended up being about like there was a lot of rejection or like feelings like I wasn't going to stay there, we were ending, and all of this like other stuff that was happening. But yeah, I don't know, it was really like, it was such a strange time. But yeah, I tend to think that I fall into like a really strange gap where I just don't even, like, I wouldn't be able to tell you which one person and how they perceive me.
Yeah, and again, it reminds me again what we've been saying all day about the courage it takes for us to be culturally attuned, because a part of the work is having part of the space, or within the space of our work together with our clients, is to allow space for the client to tell us what they think of us and what they've assumed about us, and for us to be the not focus of the session, but our identity and who they and how they relate to us, our relationship, to be part of the work. And I think that takes real courage to be able to sit with our clients and go, okay, so you've assumed X or Y about me. Let's think about that together. It takes a lot of guts, doesn't it, to kind of sit with clients and go, well, actually, I'm curious about that you think that about me, or I'm curious that you've made that assumption about me. But this goes back to one of the tenets or principles of the model, which is two identities in the room. If we put our identity to one side and we say, no, I'm a blank slate, or, oh, my identity, I've left it at the door, or it makes no difference, then I think actually we have taken the biggest element, or we're ignoring the biggest element and influencing factor in our relationship. And yet, what do we say about therapy? Regardless of modality, it's about the quality of the relationship. And guess what? That relationship is entirely based on two identities. So if we're not starting to be curious about how our clients think about us, or what they're bringing into the room or not bringing into the room, what they're choosing to share, not share, what they're assuming about who we're going to be, how we're going to relate, how we're going to work with them. If we're ignoring all of that, then I think we're missing a huge chunk of the actual work and process that we're meant to be doing with them. So I think it's good, you know, in a way it's good, Iman, that you're saying, actually, I don't know what assumptions, because it's based on the individual, but great. Be curious then about whichever client's in front of you. Be curious then about, which is what I'm asking of all of us really, be curious about what that particular client is bringing, which includes their assumptions about us. Yeah. So thank you, Iman. Yeah. We've got MT and then Sasha. Oh, you're muted, MT. Okay.
Sorry, I don't want to take up too much space, but
that's okay.
so much is kind of resonating and coming up, and I love the part about when someone asks a question, you don't necessarily immediately answer that, and I've done that quite a lot, where assumptions or tentative assumptions have been made. And actually what's interesting about that is, what does that mean for the person? Does that mean that they are withholding stuff or talking about stuff? And in one situation I'm thinking of, the not knowing meant that they then had to prioritize themselves, because they couldn't assume that they were protecting me or triggering me or any of those things. They had to take the risk and just not know and share something anyway that was meaningful. So that not knowing actually was the work. It was almost like a right, okay, so what are you going to do with that not knowing? Are you going to take the chance and do it anyway? But I also wonder as well, though, there's always this little niggle at the back of my head about power dynamics, and another situation where I was asked quite a direct question that is a common characteristic of one of my identity characteristics, and it would have been, and it was really important, given the power dynamic and my actual privilege in that situation, it was important for me to own it and to name it and to say, actually, yes. But then we did go on and explore what that then meant. So it's about that attunement, isn't it? It's the being attuned to the specific situation and the specific person, because there is no one size fits all.
Exactly. Yes.
In that latter situation, it would have been more harmful for me to bat that back as a, what would that mean for you either way? Because actually that was a power dynamic issue and a privilege issue, and it was important for me to own it. But in the other one, the not knowing was the work. And I love that. I love the nuance and the not knowing and the having to just work with what is and who is.
Yeah, absolutely. That's spot on, MT. There's something about being culturally attuned is what is going to be helpful, and how can we do the work together based on what is it we're going to explore together, or what answer I'm going to give or not give. And that example you've just given, MT, of with one client I didn't give the answer, and so we explored it. With the other client I did give an answer, and then we explored it. This for me then is a really good example of why competency doesn't work, because competency would have given you the one size fits all, just give them the answer. And how do we, with competence, what competence then doesn't take on board then is ethical practice. Because ethically in that moment, it might do harm to a client to give them an answer. With another client, it might do harm, as you said, to withhold it. So you're quite right. It's so nuanced. It's about what is important in that moment to be attuned and connected to, psychologically in contact with my client, that's going to help us do the work together and to help my client explore and, reflect further and dig deeper, as opposed to it's more important that I hold that particular boundary and hold my power and be withholding. And as you said, it's not a one size fits all. It's so specific to that moment, to that client, and to what they're asking about you. Yeah. We had Sasha next, and then Jada. Yeah.
Audio now unmuted.
Yeah, I was really interested in what MT said there. I got distracted with my own question. It was because I think I don't, unless I've got a visual aid to say that I'm visually impaired. But sometimes, like in my work, I don't show up. It's a bit different at Elsie, but I'm not sometimes seen as visually impaired. But then, so when I am, when they know that I'm visually impaired, it's almost like they have a preconceived idea of how I'm going to be, and sometimes it's not enough for them, type thing. So it's like they come with preconceived ideas, and they're either amazed of what I can or can't do, like can do, and therefore sort of almost come limited themselves with what they allow me to have. I mean, I not experienced it with maybe at Elsie, but I mean in my sort of wider life, I think it's going to show up as I sort of grow in with experience of clients. I think with what because I will be saying that on my website, because obviously I will have a dog, so to make sure that people who have allergies and things, it's sort of known. No, I was a bit sort of thrown then. I had it all planned in my head, my question, and then I was so involved in listening to MTs.
No, thank you for sharing that, Sasha. But I think again, thank you for sharing that, your very specific example. You know, I know you, Sasha, so I know that you have that lived experience then of people assuming that because of your visual impairment that somehow you're less than, and that you're less capable, and that clients then perhaps can make assumptions about what type of, or whether you'll be a good enough counsellor or not, or as you said, in your wider world you've experienced that in other situations, and so you're very aware that that might happen to you. Clients will come with an assumption that like that sense of not good enough. And that's then important to think about with your clients. And I know we've spoken about this previously, that part of the conversation is to speak to them about what it means for them and how it might impact or influence how your clients are showing up when they're in relationship with a visually impaired counsellor. Thank you, Sasha. I think we had Jada next, and then Nyla.
I was just thinking about disclosure, for example, when people ask where you're from, and this has come up quite a lot in my supervision, and in like my supervisors, like for example, working with refugee people that have been traumatized, and they actually said quite interestingly, like, you know, if it looks like you're withholding something, it might not help build the trust in the relationship. And I'm reminded of I can't remember, is it Alexandra Lemma? Was actually, she's Italian, and then when people ask, you know, if you're Italian, she'll just say yeah, because it's so obvious from her accent. So I think there is space to actually acknowledge parts of your identity particularly if it's very obvious, because it's sometimes people won't, depending on what their experiences are, might not trust you if you avoid responding, because it's like you're hiding something.
Absolutely.
Particularly when there's something sensitive around, you know, politically, you know, what your position might be.
Yeah, absolutely. It goes back to, you know, again, MT's example of, it's about, is it going to help or hinder the work, essentially? Actually, if somebody knowing your ethnicity is essential for them to trust you, for them to feel safe, because their lived experience of ethnicity means that they have a particular lived experience of it. This again is about being culturally attuned. Then of course we share it. So again, this is really moving us away from competency. Do I or don't I share that particular aspect of my identity? It's about, in that moment with that client, is it helpful? Is it appropriate? Is it ethical? Is it part of the work? Then yes, then you share it. But I think it is about, you're right though, Jada, it is about moving away from, we either don't at all, or, you know, we don't disclose at all, or we do disclose everything. Again, it's not mutually exclusive. It's not that black and white. I think this moves us into a position of attunement, you know, with your refugee clients. Actually, yes, for you to share your ethnicity or your heritage. Actually, it's because that's a big part of why they've had the lived experience that they've had. So for them to know your ethnicity actually enables you to do the work together. So it's essential. Absolutely. Thank you for that example. Yeah. Nyla.
Yeah, as Sasha was speaking, it just made me think about it's not just like the assumptions that our clients make about us that we've got to consider, it's maybe also the assumptions that our peers and colleagues make, and yeah, about our identities and potential links with competence and ability and things like that. Because unfortunately, yeah, like psychology in particular, there's a lot of like ableism and prejudice. And I just wondered, would you advocate the same kind of approach with colleagues and peers as what you're advocating with clients, so having that curiosity about where their assumptions that they're making about our abilities come from, or would there be situations where would that make it a little bit different? I don't know.
Again, I think it's about attuning to that person in that moment, and if it's not a black and white answer, but I am always curious. I think there's something about when people are making assumptions, when people are, I suppose because I'm always curious about how people are relating to me, because I'm curious about what is it about my identity that means then that people treat me in the way that they do and relate to me in the way that they do. And I think when equally as it comes to clients, I think we apply it equally to peers and colleagues as well, which is be curious about their answer. Because I think, again, if we think of like the metaphor of like a spotlight, what a colleague might do in asking a question to you is that they've taken that spotlight of them and they've put it on you. And I think very often through socialization, when we're asked a question, we feel the spotlight on us, and we feel the only way to get it, we feel the spotlight on us, and therefore we feel we have to answer. What I, in my head, do is every time a client asks me a question about me, I visually in my head go, oh, they've just taken that spotlight and taken it off them and they've put it on me. So I'm a bit like, oh, I wonder why they've taken it off themselves. So guess what I do? I go, back on you. And I do that, obviously not in a interrogative way, but in a sense of I'm curious. So I'm wondering if, yeah, absolutely, Nyla, is it, and again, it's not black and white, do that or don't do it. I think it's about, is it, I ask of myself, is it appropriate for me to put the spotlight back on that person right now? And if it's not, because they've asked me a question in the middle of the kitchen, loads of people are in the kitchen, it might just be a case of, rather than putting the spotlight back on them, I'll switch the spotlight off metaphorically and go, do you know what, it'd be great for us to have a conversation about that, but not right now. So it's about managing the process that they're trying to engage us in. So metaphorically in my head, I'm thinking about where is the spotlight shining and who's moved it. Yeah, I hope that answered your question. Yeah. I'm mindful of the time. We've come to 3:05, and so we're due a break. So if we come back then at 20-minute break, sorry. So if we come back at 25 past, that's a 20-minute break. Okay, and I'll see you then.